A 7-foot center named Shawn Bradley once told a reporter that Michael Jordan was too slight to survive inside. And on March 31, 1996, Bradley's own statistics told a story he would spend the rest of his career trying to forget. It was a Sunday evening in Chicago, the United Center already filling with the particular electricity that comes not from a close game, but from an impending execution. The arena held 21,000 people, and the floor gleamed under lights so bright they washed the shadows out from under the players' feet. Spring had barely touched the city outside. Inside, it was already summer. The Bulls were 39 games ahead of 500. They were on their way to 72 wins, a record that at the time felt not merely unprecedented, but structurally impossible, like a building that violated the laws of physics by simply refusing to fall. And yet there was Shawn Bradley, 7 feet and 6 inches of Dallas Mavericks center, warming up at the far end of the floor with the body language of a man who had told himself a story he believed entirely. He had averaged over 2 blocked shots a game that season. He had spoken to the Dallas press about defending perimeter players who drove to the basket, about the geometry of his wingspan, about how size, in the end, was the one variable that could not be coached away. The implication was clear even when the name was unspoken. He meant Jordan. Everyone in the building knew he meant Jordan. Jordan was 26 feet away, working on mid-range pull-ups with a quietness that had nothing relaxed in it. His warm-up was not leisurely. It was systematic, methodical, the repetition of a man who did not believe in spontaneous greatness, who believed instead that excellence was a structure you built before the game started, brick by brick, so that when the moment arrived, your body already knew the answer. He taped his wrists himself always, pulling the athletic tape with a slow, even tension that his teammates had long ago learned to read. When Jordan taped slowly, the game was already decided in his mind. He was not preparing to compete. He was preparing to demonstrate. This was the season no one on earth could touch him. He was averaging 30.4 points per game. He had won 7 consecutive scoring titles. He had already been through the retirement, through the baseball years in Birmingham and Scottsdale, through the doubts of the analysts who said the game had passed him, who said young legs and new defenses had rendered him historical. He had returned in March of the previous year, number 45 on his back, a little tentative, a little human, and by the time he arrived at this Sunday in late March 1996, with number 23 restored, the tentativeness was gone. What replaced it was something older and colder, something that burned at a temperature the human eye cannot comfortably look at directly. Some men returned from exile unchanged. Jordan returned sharpened. Shawn Bradley had been in the league since 1993, drafted 2nd overall by the Philadelphia 76ers out of Brigham Young University, a prodigy of length who had played only 1 college season before declaring. The expectations were enormous. The reality was complicated. In Philadelphia, he had been benched, traded, questioned publicly, his limitations exposed in the merciless fluorescence of NBA analysis. In Dallas, he had found a kind of professional stability, a role, a number, a function. He blocked shots. He protected the rim. He made centers think twice before challenging him in the paint. His coaches told him he was valuable. The Dallas newspaper called him a cornerstone, and perhaps because he needed to believe it, and perhaps because certainty has always been a more comfortable country than doubt, Bradley carried himself in the weeks before this game with the confidence of a man who had resolved all his internal arguments. He had made, in the preceding days, statements about rim protection that were accurate as far as they went. He led the conference in certain defensive metrics. The numbers were real. The problem was not the numbers. The problem was the framework. The problem was that Bradley had looked at a statistical category and confused it with a comprehensive description of Michael Jordan. No one had ever been able to reduce Jordan to a category. He had spent 11 years demonstrating this with a thoroughness that by 1996 bordered on philosophical argument. He was not a scorer who also defended. He was not a defender who also scored. He was something the game had not developed adequate language to describe, a player whose will exceeded the vocabulary of any position, whose hunger was so structurally central to his identity that calling it motivation was like calling the ocean wet. The word was technically correct and entirely inadequate. Jordan had heard about Bradley's comments. He had heard about them in the way he heard about all such comments, through the elaborate early warning system of his competitive ego, which processed perceived slights the way other organisms process oxygen. It was not that he went looking for them. It was that they found him because some part of him was always listening. His former teammates would describe, years later, the quality of Jordan's silence when someone had said the wrong thing. It was not an angry silence. Anger was too hot, too unstable. This was a collecting silence, a patient silence, the silence of something that had already decided. He had heard about the comments, and he had said nothing. He said nothing to the reporters who asked. He said nothing in the locker room. He went through his pre-game routine with the same measured, almost ceremonial precision he always brought to it. The stretching, the taping, the specific sequence of his shooting warm-up. The last 5 minutes of absolute stillness, in which his teammates knew, without being told, not to speak to him. He was building a room inside himself that the game would eventually enter. The tip-off came at 7:30. The first quarter unfolded in the half-controlled chaos of an NBA game between a 60-win team and a team still fighting for a playoff position, the Mavericks scrappy and desperate, Bradley establishing position in the paint with the elbows-out physicality of a player who knew his one tool and intended to use it. He was blocking sightlines, contesting guards at the rim, making himself as large as possible in the most literal geometrical sense. He talked during the first few minutes, in the low continuous commentary that big men keep up under the basket, instructing the air around him about what would and would not be permitted. Jordan watched. Jordan waited. Jordan scored 11 points in the first quarter, and none of them were at the rim. He was gathering information. He was showing Bradley exactly enough of his game to make the 7-footer feel confident, to let the narrative Bradley was telling himself about the night continue uninterrupted. Jordan understood something about opponents that was almost clinical in its precision. You never defeated a man who did not first believe he was winning. The defeat had to arrive as a revision, as a sudden rewriting of a story the opponent had already half finished, because only then did it land with the full weight of humiliation rather than the manageable weight of a sporting loss. There is a difference between losing and being unmade. Jordan was never interested in the former. The Mavericks led by 3 at the end of the first quarter. Bradley had 2 blocks and was communicating this fact to the near vicinity with considerable enthusiasm. The Dallas bench was animated. The Chicago crowd, 21,000 people who had watched Jordan long enough to recognize the gathering quiet of his preparation, watched and waited with the knowing patience of an audience at a magic show who understand that the deception is structural, that the moment of revelation has been planned from the beginning. The second quarter opened with Jordan going left, which he did not often do in traffic, the kind of tactical departure that announces intention to those who can read it. He was testing the lane geometry around Bradley's positioning, measuring the dimensions of the problem the way an architect measures a wall he intends to demolish. Bradley challenged him twice, both times successfully in the narrow technical sense, altering Jordan's angle enough to force a pass or a pullback. The crowd registered each stop, with the complex silence of an audience watching the first act of a play it has already seen the last act of. Jordan's expression during these exchanges was not frustration. His teammates, Scottie Pippen and Tony Kukoc and Ron Harper, knew the difference between Jordan frustrated and Jordan patient. The frustrated Jordan was visible. The patient Jordan was glacial and terrifying, a man who had removed from his face everything that was not calculation. Halfway through the second quarter, with the Mavericks clinging to a 2-point lead, a Dallas guard drove the lane and drew a foul, and Bradley, jogging back on defense, glanced at Jordan with the particular look of a competitor who believes the momentum has shifted. It was a small look. It lasted perhaps 1 second. Jordan caught it with the peripheral vision he seemed to maintain for exactly this kind of exchange, and something in his jaw changed, a minor tightening that Pippen, standing 4 feet away, noticed immediately. Pippen would say later, in the relaxed candor of a man speaking from the far side of a championship, that he felt sorry for Bradley in that moment. Not because of anything Jordan had done, because of that look. He had given Jordan exactly what Jordan needed. The Mavericks went into halftime leading by 1, a fact that the Dallas locker room treated with the cautious optimism of people who knew the score without quite believing it. Their coaches reviewed adjustments. Bradley sat with his elbows on his knees and reviewed the first half with the technical attention of a craftsman examining his work. He had defended Jordan adequately. He had not surrendered the rim. He had statistics that supported a narrative of effectiveness. He held these facts like a shield and did not yet understand that the shield was made of paper. In the Chicago locker room, Phil Jackson spoke briefly and carefully in the oblique, Zen-inflected language that his players had learned to translate over years of championship practice. Jordan did not speak in the halftime huddle. He sat in his chair with his jersey soaked and his eyes somewhere else, somewhere the room could not follow, deep in the architectural plans for the second half. The public story going into the third quarter was a competitive game. The private story, the one Jordan was already living inside, was not competitive at all. The third quarter began, and Jordan began the process of revision. It started not with a spectacular play, but with movement, with the specific geometry of how Jordan began positioning himself relative to Bradley's location on the floor. He was mapping the seven-footer's instincts, identifying the habitual responses, the automatic defensive reflexes that every player develops over years of practice, and that become, in the hands of a sufficiently intelligent offensive player, not protections, but vulnerabilities. Every habit is a prediction, and a prediction is an exploitable pattern. Jordan scored 6 consecutive points in the opening 3 minutes of the third quarter, none of them at the rim. He was making Bradley irrelevant by design, conducting the game from the mid-range distances where Bradley's length could not reach him, pulling up from 15 feet with the mechanical certainty of a player whose shot had been built not from talent alone, but from 10,000 hours of repetition in empty gymnasiums before the sun came up, in the specific darkness before dawn that only the genuinely obsessed ever inhabit. Bradley was defending adequately. This was the problem. He was doing what he was supposed to do. He was executing his role, and Jordan was simply operating from an elevation that the role could not address. This was the first layer of the humiliation, not a physical domination, but a categorical one. The suggestion that the very framework Bradley had prepared to operate within was not the framework Jordan intended to use. The crowd felt it before Bradley did. 21,000 people who had watched this before, who understood the tempo of Jordan's particular kind of cruelty, began to shift in their seats with the anticipation of what was being assembled. The noise had changed quality. It was no longer the reactive noise of fans responding to plays. It was the expectant noise of witnesses. The Bulls went up by 4, then 7, then 9, and then Jordan turned the corner. It came with 6 minutes left in the third quarter, on a possession that began as a standard Bulls half-court set. Pippen handling the ball at the top of the key, Jordan moving off a screen from Luke Longley near the elbow. Bradley tracked it, communicating his positioning with a raised fist to his teammates, announcing his readiness. Jordan caught the ball on the left wing, 15 feet from the basket, with Bradley's hand already rising toward his shooting lane. What happened in the next 4 seconds was the kind of thing that reduces professional basketball to its purest narrative elements. Jordan did not shoot immediately. He held the ball. He held it for a beat, a half beat beyond what the defense expected, absorbing Bradley's closing momentum and then using it, pivoting into the lane as Bradley's weight committed forward, the 7-footer's body suddenly moving in the wrong direction at the worst possible moment, his length now working against him, like a ship that cannot stop turning once it has begun, his 275 pounds following his momentum into a space Jordan was already leaving. Jordan went up. The arena did not immediately react. There was the suspended moment, the collective held breath that precedes understanding, the fraction of a second in which 21,000 people processed what they were seeing. Bradley, having committed, could not recover. He was still moving forward as Jordan was already above him, the basketball rising from Jordan's right hand at the apex of a jump that seemed to have no relationship to ordinary human physics, the ball leaving his fingertips with the particular backspin of a shot that has been made correctly at the cellular level, the kind of shot that does not require the basket, that has already arrived before it arrives. It went in. It went in the way the sun rises, not as an event but as an inevitability. the conclusion of a sequence that had been arranged long before the ball left Jordan's hand. Bradley landed. He stood for a moment with his hands on his hips and his head slightly forward, looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has just had a long and careful argument defeated by a single sentence. He had been correct about everything in his framework. He had been wrong about the framework. This is a more disorienting defeat than simple error because it does not just invalidate a conclusion, it invalidates the entire method. Jordan came down from the jump and did not look at Bradley. He turned up the floor already in transition, his face showing nothing that could be photographed as celebration, only the focused neutrality of a man who has done what he came to do and is already thinking about what comes next. This was, for Bradley, the detail that was hardest to absorb. The Bulls extended the lead. Dallas stopped scoring with regularity, not because their players had stopped trying, but because the psychological weather of the game had changed in the way it changes when Jordan operates at a certain frequency. When the pressure he generates is not just physical but existential. When the opponent must play while simultaneously managing the awareness that they have already lost the argument and that every subsequent possession is simply the continued public demonstration of that fact. Jordan finished the third quarter with 18 points, 11 of them in the final 6 minutes. Bradley finished the third quarter standing near the free throw line, watching Jordan walk to the bench at the buzzer, and the posture of that watching contained something that was not athletic in nature. It was the posture of a student who has studied the wrong subject for an important examination, who has arrived prepared and discovered that preparation was not the relevant variable. The fourth quarter was not a formality, but it was also not a contest in the way the first half had been a contest. The Mavericks competed, as professional athletes always compete, with the residual professionalism that remains after the central argument has been resolved. They ran their sets. They contested shots. Bradley continued to protect the rim with the technical diligence of a craftsman who finishes his work even after the commission has been withdrawn. But something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the building, the way pressure shifts after lightning, when the storm has already revealed its main event and the remaining thunder is just the sky processing what happened. Jordan finished with 41 points, 8 rebounds and 6 assists. The final score was 112-97. The number that tells the story most clearly is not the 41. It is the 6 assists, which means that in the moments when Jordan was not scoring, he was manufacturing the conditions for others to score, which means he was not just winning, but orchestrating, which means the game was not a performance, but a composition. Jordan is both soloist and conductor, the ensemble always in service of a vision only he could fully hear. The moment the final buzzer sounded, Bradley stood at mid-court for longer than post-game protocol requires. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the Chicago bench where Jordan was accepting congratulations from teammates with the brief, controlled warmth of a man who knows the celebration is not the point. The loss had been a basketball loss in every official sense. The scorebook would record it accurately. But in the interior life of Shawn Bradley, something more permanent had been deposited that night, a memory that had not yet finished teaching him what it intended to teach. He would say in a post-game press conference, his voice careful and drained, that Jordan was the best player in the world. He would say it the way people say true things they wish were not true, with the flat effect of a man reading a document he did not write and would not have written. The reporters wrote it down. The cameras captured his face. The footage is still available. Jordan, 3 locker rooms and 1 hallway away, was already in the shower when Bradley finished speaking. He had said to the media, who cornered him near his locker, that it was a good win, that the team was playing well, that they were focused on finishing the season strong. He said all of this in the practiced, measured cadence of a superstar who has long since learned that the interview is not the place where the truth lives. He had not mentioned Bradley by name. He had not needed to. He never needed to. This was something Jordan understood about public dominance that many of his contemporaries did not fully grasp. That the most devastating statement is the one you decline to make. That the refusal to acknowledge a defeated opponent as worthy of direct address is itself the most complete form of dismissal. When you name someone, you elevate them to the level of an argument. When you do not name them, you confirm what the scoreboard has already said. Bradley had declared that Jordan was too small for certain situations. Jordan had answered the declaration with 41 points, had answered it with geometry and timing and the specific kind of patience that only exists in people who have been genuinely wounded and have converted the wound into methodology. Jordan left the United Center that night in a car that pulled away from the back entrance while the building was still processing the evening. He did not look back at the arena. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him in this period, already thinking about the next game. This was not indifference to what had happened, it was the opposite. He had used what he needed from the evening, and he had no further use for it. The wound that Bradley's comments had opened had already been converted into the 41 points. The account was closed. The scar tissue had been laid down, and it would harden, like all the others, into the dense, load-bearing structure of his competitive architecture. He was not finished. He was never finished. That was the thing his opponents consistently failed to understand about him. They thought of him as a man who wanted to win. He was a man who needed to win, which is a different thing entirely. A need with no bottom, a hunger that was not satisfied by eating, but was instead amplified by it. Each victory not closing the account, but opening a larger one. Each night of excellence raising the floor below which excellence was no longer excellence but failure. Bradley would play 11 more seasons in the NBA. He would have moments of genuine professional satisfaction. He would continue to block shots, to protect the rim, to execute the role he had defined for himself with the craftsmanship of a man who had made peace with his limitations. He was not destroyed by that March evening in Chicago. Athletes at his level are not destroyed by single performances. They are shaped by them, the way rock is shaped by water, not through violence but through accumulation, the slow, persistent pressure of repeated contact over time. But he would also carry that night. He would carry the specific memory of that 4-second possession in the third quarter, of his body moving forward while Jordan moved up, of the ball describing its arc above his extended fingertips with an indifference that felt almost personal. He would carry it not as trauma, but as knowledge. The specific knowledge of having stood inside the force of something that could not be adequately prepared for. The knowledge that some gaps between human beings are not gaps of effort or intelligence or dedication, but of a more fundamental kind. The gap between the excellent and the unrepeatable. Jordan was, in 1996, not simply the best basketball player in the world. He was a category error, a player whose presence in a competition changed the nature of what competition meant, who forced every opponent to answer not just a tactical question, but a philosophical one. The question was, do you understand what you're dealing with, and if you do understand it, can you still find within yourself the resources to compete? Most could not because they lacked ability, but because the answer to that philosophical question, once honestly confronted, has a weight that athletic preparation is not designed to carry. This is why the story of that night is not primarily Jordan's story, it is Bradley's story. The victim's perspective is always the more illuminating one, because the victim feels the full force of what the dominant figure represents. Jordan was doing what he always did. Bradley was discovering what that meant, discovering it in public, in front of 21,000 people, in a building that would be remembered as one of the most concentrated sites of competitive perfection in the history of American sport. The season would end in June with the Bulls completing 72 wins and a championship. Phil Jackson's team confirming on the largest possible stage what smaller stages had been quietly establishing all year. Jordan would win his 4th title, his 4th Finals MVP, his 8th scoring title. The numbers would enter the record books and remain there as what numbers always are in sports, the compressed remains of nights that contained much more than numbers can hold. But here is the thing about that March evening, the thing that the formal record does not quite capture. The 41 points are documented. The final score is documented. What is not documented because it does not belong in a box score is the quality of the silence that fell over the Dallas locker room after the final buzzer, the specific weight of that silence, the way it pressed down on the men inside it as they unlaced their shoes and removed their jerseys, and sat with the physical reality of what the evening had been. Bradley sat in that silence for a long time. He had come to Chicago prepared by his own lights and by any reasonable external standard. He had done the work. He had reviewed the film. He had committed to his role with the full weight of his professional dedication. He had been told, and had believed, that preparation was the variable that mattered, that effort multiplied by intelligence equaled outcome, and that this formula, properly applied, would give any sufficiently dedicated professional the tools to compete with any opponent. What he discovered in the third quarter of that game, in 4 seconds of basketball that continued to exist in archival footage with the calm permanence of all recorded things, is that the formula is correct but incomplete, that there exists in certain rare human beings an additional variable that the formula does not account for, a quality that is not talent in the ordinary sense, that is not work in the ordinary sense, that is not intelligence in the ordinary sense, but that is something closer to the conversion of accumulated grievance into controlled energy, the transformation of every slight and dismissal and underestimation the person has ever received into a renewable fuel source that does not run out and does not degrade. Jordan had been called too small. He had been told he was not big enough for the situations that mattered. He had stored this information in the same place he stored every such piece of information, in the load-bearing structure of his competitive identity, where it could not weigh him down because it had been converted into something that moved upward instead of down. And in the third quarter, on a possession that lasted 4 seconds, he spent it. The arena is still there, on West Madison Street in Chicago. The footage is archived, the box scores are preserved in the public record. Bradley went on with his life and his career with the dignity that all serious professional athletes maintain, even through the lessons that cost the most. The world continued, the game continued. But if you watch that footage, if you find the third quarter possession and slow it down to the frame-by-frame patience that modern technology permits, you will see in Shawn Bradley's face, in the exact moment Jordan's shot left his fingertips, the precise expression of a man who has just understood something irreversible. It is not pain, it is not rage. It is the quiet, specific expression of a man receiving knowledge he had not asked for and cannot refuse. His eyes track the ball. His hands are still slightly raised because the body continues the motion the mind has already abandoned. He understands in that moment what the score has been the entire time. The game was never about size. It was never about wingspan or rim protection or the geometric certainty of 7 feet versus 6 feet 6. It was about the quality that lives below all measurements, the quality that has no unit of account, that cannot be tracked by any statistic currently in use, the quality that Michael Jordan carried into every building he ever played in as the central fact of his presence, more certain than his jump shot and more durable than his athleticism. The quality of a man for whom an opponent's certainty was not a neutral fact but an invitation, for whom being underestimated was not a disadvantage but a fuel source, for whom the gap between what someone believed about him and what was actually true was not a gap at all but a loaded spring. 7 feet is a measurement. What Jordan had was not a measurement, it was a condition, and the only thing you can do with a condition is live inside it, or spend your career learning to accept that someone else's is greater than yours, which is perhaps the most important, most transferable, most universally applicable lesson that an evening of basketball in Chicago in March of 1996 has to offer any human being who has ever been told by anyone, in any context, that they are not enough for the situation they have decided to enter. The scoreboard settles arguments, but it is the decision to enter the room that determines the character.